Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. It's the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, so that whether it's an issue you may not have thought of or one you can't escape from, you have facts to back up your positions on it. And joining us to kick off on one of those that you just can't seem to get away from is the issue of the president's student loan debt cancellation proposal. Neal McCluskey, the director of the Center for Educational Freedom at the CATO Institute. Neal, welcome back to the program. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing all right. Thank you.
I imagine that the first point of order is that the educational freedom is not coming from the debt cancellation that the president has announced. When we talk about freedom, and I was mentioning this to somebody during the week, we have conflated freedom with money, and I guess that's what the president is playing on, this idea that if I forgive this money, then that will give you $10,000 more freedom. Is that his idea?
Well, I don't know how much he's couching this in freedom, but I suppose that he or others who support this may say, well, it's freedom from debt. So for many decades, the federal government has run programs that enable people to take on debt to go to college. Part of that thought process was, well, okay, we'll give people freedom by giving them money to go to college and get an education that will enable them to get more money over their lifetime, which maybe is more freedom. Of course, the flip side of that is it's taken from taxpayers who don't have freedom. They don't get to decide whether or not these programs exist, and they certainly don't get to decide whether any given borrower gets money. So that's the freedom part we forget. But so they've run these programs, though, for many decades, and what it turns out is that one major problem is colleges raise their prices and capture the aid. And the more aid you put out there, the more colleges can raise their prices. And so we saw a lot of the debt continued to grow, and the amount of debt and the number of people going to college grew, and we saw more and more employers for jobs that didn't actually previously require a college degree start saying, okay, you have to get a college degree. So this effort to make this more free, more freedom for people, actually forced more people into college and to pay higher prices and therefore to take on more debt. And so now what the president is saying, well, you know that thing that we did to artificially create, quote unquote, more freedom? Well, it's become a problem. So the way we're going to fix that is we're going to cancel a whole bunch of those debts, no matter, basically why you took them on, what you did for them. If you make less than $125,000 as an individual or less than $250,000 as a household, we're going to forgive $10,000 to $20,000 of that debt because we feel like this debt is a burden. And maybe that'll give people who have that debt more of a feeling of freedom. But again, the taxpayers don't have a choice in this. They didn't have freedom. They now pay for the debts that were supposed to be repaid by the people who took them so that they can earn a lot more money by having gotten a college degree. And all this is ultimately going to do is fuel even higher prices that force people to take on more debt to go to college, because colleges will think, you know what? We should raise our prices because the president, or maybe someday Congress, but the federal government will have to forgive debt in the future, because you can't justify doing it today and then 5 years later say, okay, well, now this group isn't deserving, so we won't forgive it. Everyone's going to assume that forgiveness has to come in the future, so colleges say, oh, we'll raise our prices even more and tell students, don't worry. This will be eventually forgiven, and students will think, there's precedent for that, so I should borrow some more, and maybe I should borrow more to go to the college that not just has classes but has an on-campus water park or something more expensive that will make my time there fun. So maybe the idea is originally to give people freedom to go to college. Now it's freedom from debt. But it ends up trapping people even worse than before the government got involved, and the taxpayers ultimately pay the price because they don't have freedom, and someone said, we'll just take things, whether they like it or not, from them.
this is perhaps the most stunning part, and I still don't think there's much specificity in the president's plan aside from the magic wand and the 10,000. But it doesn't appear that the universities are shrugging, saying, "Okay, I guess we won't get paid." This is money the universities will still get paid. In many cases, already have, and that this is Bernie Mac or Sally Mae or Ed Financial basically taking it from other taxpayers, or I presume like Wimpy from the Popeye cartoons will gladly tax you Tuesday for some spending today. They will give this money to these banks, and then they will be whole, and it will again be the Treasury that's sitting there with devalued dollars, Neal, if I understand it correctly.
Yeah, well, it's hard to sort of keep track of where we are on student loans. There was a long time where the primary federal student loan program was through banks or other lenders, ostensibly private. That was called the FFEL program. Now I can't remember what it is because it's actually been gone for a little while. I mean, what FFEL stands for. But even that program guaranteed the banks essentially a profit and no risk. So if they lent money to somebody through a federal program and that person defaulted, the federal government said, here's all of your money back, or almost all of your money, depending on what year we're talking about, because it changed a little. But for the most part, they said, look, we're going to make sure you make profits. And that's how we'll get banks to do this kind of lending. But since 2010, we have been at all something called direct lending, where there are no more banks involved, no more lenders. It is just somebody going to the federal government and saying, I want a federal student loan, and that money comes directly out of the Treasury. So no banks involved. It's just right out of the taxpayer's pocket. And so what we're seeing now is ultimately the taxpayer's on the hook for all of this, but this is essentially saying, you know what, the people who borrowed, they don't have to give this back to the taxpayers, out of whose pocket it came directly. And while the price of college was artificially high, the need to get a degree was artificially inflated because of all this student aid, it's still really important to understand that for most people, taking a loan to go to college pays off. So the average person with a bachelor's degree makes about $1.2 million more over their lifetime than someone with just a high school diploma. If you go to medical school or law school, on average you'll make $3.1 million more over your lifetime. And oh, by the way, disproportionately, loans are used to go to graduate school. So while student aid has made the higher education pricing system crazy and too expensive, people who take these loans and finish school are still getting a huge payoff on the taxpayer dime and need to repay the taxpayer.
Neal McCluskey is on with us from the CATO Institute and their Director of Education Freedom and work towards that. Where is then, if you're talking about the lion's share, as you just did, of these folks who do benefit from higher education, is it a small percentage that are doing this large amount of damage, taking out loans for jobs that don't exist, and then winding up incapable of finding jobs to help them pay back those loans? And if so, is this just another case of a politician pandering with some money to get some cheap airtime?
Well, I mean, it's a lot of different things. The cynic in me thinks that a lot of it is politicians pandering to get cheap airtime. I think there was a lot of political pressure brought on the Biden administration by progressives in his party, both members of the party like Senator Warren and Senator Schumer, who were long pushing for $50,000 in debt forgiveness across the board. And then progressive constituencies. There's a very, we'll just say, a highly motivated group of people with student debt who this is their issue, this is their political issue, and they're very aggressive about getting student debt canceled. So part of this may be a cynical ploy, a part of it may be, we are coming up on midterm elections, that you want to energize your base. A part of it may be that they feel a little, nervous about the people whose this is their issue, this student debt forgiveness. And there are certainly arguments and people who you can be sympathetic to that have student debt and truly struggle to repay it. But this is not focused on them, and that is a huge problem with it. So a lot of the debt is people who take on $100,000 of debt or so, but that's actually a very small percentage of the debtors. So, wow. And those are people who tend to do things like go to medical school and go to law school, which are expensive, in part because of the aid, but also lead to much higher lifetime earnings so that you pay that debt off. And we should remember, the point of taking debt is to get money when you don't have it, to invest in something that will deliver a lot of money later on. The people who are really the most behind the eight ball tend to be people who went to college, who are probably on the margins at best of being able to handle a program that had good employment prospects, but who felt they had to go to college because maybe the job they were looking for now requires a degree. And so they said, okay, we'll do it. And these folks tended to take on relatively little debt, sometimes just around $7,000, $8,000, $9,000 of debt, but didn't finish their program. So they didn't get all those big earnings. Disproportionately, it's people with very small debt who are the ones who are defaulting. They're the ones, if you're going to help somebody, it should be focused on. But this says if you're in a household making up to $250,000 a year, you can get debt forgiveness. Those folks don't need help. Right. It should, if you're going to do it, just have it for the people in the lowest income level, and this goes far beyond that.
Neal, let me ask you this, and I find some irony, and it may just be surface-level irony, that the administration and President Obama's administration spent quite a deal of time pointing out that for-profit colleges, they were sending FBI and Department of Justice investigations. We've got the case of ITT, where they'll go after for-profit, quote-unquote, colleges that don't or inflate the results they are required by law to announce to prospective students regarding employment possibilities. Yet the public universities like the University of Virginia or Virginia Tech don't seem to even be asked, hey, if I get this degree, what are my job prospects and are they anywhere here in Virginia? That seems to be something that these universities don't have to live up to.
Well, that is a really big problem. Now, if you look at student debt data and you look at defaults, it is true that disproportionately people who default have gone to for-profit schools. It's about 11% or so within 3 years default. But it's also the case that among not-for-profit public students, it's around 7 or so percent, and for not-for-profit private students, it's around 5%. So for-profits are a little worse, but not drastically worse. And what's really important to understand about for-profits is, for one thing, they don't have all the benefits that go with being not-for-profit. If you donate to a for-profit school, you don't get a tax credit. Unlike Virginia or Virginia Tech, for-profits don't get direct subsidies from the state. Or unlike community colleges that are all over Virginia, they don't get local subsidies so that they can have low prices. So one of the reasons for-profits have more defaults and cost more is because they actually have to reflect more of the costs of what they do. And it's certainly true that they're trying to make profits, but Virginia Tech, Virginia, VCU, just about every putatively not-for-profit college wants to make as much revenue as they can. It's just they don't call it profit because they don't pay owners or investors. They give you professors more sabbaticals, or they hire more administrators so that the administrators can have bigger fiefdoms and things like that. And then the other thing is for-profits are under much more regulatory scrutiny no matter what, because they have the education department people, but they also have the Securities and Exchange people, or commission people. They have all these other people looking at them, and because they're for-profit, they're politically unpopular, and they have state attorneys general constantly pulling them apart. Sometimes it turns out, or at least appears, for political gain. So for-profit schools do not get good outcomes, but it's crucial to understand neither do public colleges or nonprofit privates. And the other thing about for-profits is they work with the people who are most on the margins, people who tend to have the greatest obstacles for success. They tend to be older, lower income, often working, often with families. And so, of course, they're not going to get as good an outcome as Virginia or Virginia Tech, who are pulling from top students, traditional college-age kids from typically, pretty well-to-do families who don't have all those obstacles.
Neal, let me ask you about one of the things that has come up as a real calling card of both sides politically, at least on the grassroots level, in this. And I don't know if the president misunderstood the ire of some of his political supporters regarding the endowments of a lot of these universities. They're massive, and yet the president said, we're going to forgive this debt without ever asking the universities to chip in from these endowments. Is that an unfair criticism? Because it seems to be coming from both sides.
Well, I think it's a little unfair to focus on endowments. What it is fair to say is almost every college is a revenue maximizer. They want to get as much money as they can, not because they're necessarily more greedy than anyone else, but because everybody who runs an operation thinks, I could do some great stuff if I had more money.
Sure.
And so they are all trying to get as much money as they can. The problem with the endowments argument is it's only actually a very small percentage of colleges and universities that had big endowments. I think the last I saw, it was probably like 128 had $1 billion or more. There are something like 4,500 colleges and universities. So people tend to think, well, why should Harvard or Princeton or Yale or Stanford or UVA or Virginia Tech or William and Mary, why should they get basically rewarded for having high prices when they also have these big endowments, and they are kind of being rewarded for high prices by canceling the debt? But not only do most colleges not have big endowments, but this does nothing to not send them money. The debt is from money they have already gotten. So it's fair to say, why do colleges charge so much? The answer in many cases is because federal student aid is out there, and of course they're going to do that, and it applies to every college almost, except for maybe Hillsdale and the 2 or 3 others that don't take students with federal aid. But the endowments themselves are not the real problem. The problem is natural incentives. If I run a college like any other organization, I want as much money as I can get, and federal student aid enables me to get it through students.
Neal McCluskey on with us from the CATO Institute, cato.org. Neal, my daughter just finished Virginia Commonwealth University, and I believe her last full year of scholarship there, she spent out of pocket $937 because of scholarships and grants that she earned and she applied for and were out there. Does this fixation on student loans and federal student loans, Pell Grants, that kind of thing, diminish the amount of philanthropy towards scholarship creation and not restrict, but recede the amount of scholarship money that's out there philanthropically?
Well, that is a good question, and I don't know that I've seen that studied, essentially whether or not somebody who has $200 million, whether or not they decide to donate $20,000 to a school. My guess would be most of them don't think about, well, okay, but we're already paying for this through our taxes. Maybe they do. What we've seen more documented is that if there is federal student aid, it changes whom to whom many colleges will give their own aid. So it is worth noting that many colleges have a lot of grant aid that they will give to students. So your sticker price that everybody is presented with may be $25,000, but you may find that almost nobody pays more than $15,000 because the colleges know the whole time that a lot of what they'll do is give their own institutional aid, and then they'll use Pell Grants and student loans and work study to fill in a whole lot of the rest of it. And there's evidence that what happens is when there's more federal aid, colleges will either give less of their own grant aid or they'll change who they give it to. So they'll start using their own grant aid to try and lure in students maybe with higher than average test scores or higher than average GPAs, because many colleges want to rise in college rankings, and the way you do that is you attract students that have higher test scores that add to the prestige of the school. And so there's often a lot of gaming of the money that the institution has to replace it with student loans and then change the focus of your own aid to try and build your student body so that it seems more impressive and you can rise in the rankings.
What about the high school? Well, we're going to call them middlemen for this. We were just talking about pharmaceutical issues last episode. So we're going to call the school guidance counselors, the high school guidance counselors, the middle men in this. Are we doing a good enough job with the high school students that are getting ready to graduate in helping them figure out what it is they're gifted to do, what they need to do to bring that to bear in the economy, and where they're best suited to go to school to train up in it?
Yeah, I'm loath to lay this all at the feet of guidance counselors. Guidance counselors work in the environment that public policy often sets up, and for in K through 12 education, a lot of public policy has been focused on standardized test scores and trying to move all students to the exact same place. And it's guidance counselors' jobs, I think, often to try and get as many people to college as they can, whether college is a good idea or not, because what high schools tend to be looked at is how many kids went to college. But it may well be that lots of kids don't want to spend 4 years or more in a traditional college, taking a liberal arts core, and then maybe moving on to learn what they're interested in, whether it's engineering or, it could be art or anything like that. What they may need is and what may be most efficient is to not have that liberal arts core and move right on to what you think is most important. Part of that is a K through 12 problem. We have a top-down education system. In Virginia, the state has a lot of say over what the schools do. You have the SOL test, and it's all about high test scores, getting kids to college, and if you don't fit that mold, you're in trouble. You don't have a lot of options. We need to fix that in K through 12 education. We need a lot more school choice. That has been a major emphasis in K through 12 education, especially under COVID and since COVID, so that people who don't want to go to college, don't want to continue in sort of structured formal academics, have other options. They can enter apprenticeship programs. They can do more vocational training. I think that the governor is talking about sort of lab schools that are more focused on kind of practical knowledge and hard skills, and that's probably a move in the right direction. I think that the state, though, needs to massively expand its tiny scholarship tax credit program. It's only about $25 million. It could easily be $100 million, because we've got to reach people and students, families, at the beginning of education, enabling them to tailor education based on the needs and desires of unique students. And if we did that, I think you'd see a lot more options in K through 12 that prepare you for a job so that you don't have to instead go to college for 4 years, do a whole bunch of other things, and then maybe get the preparation for the job you could have had 4 years ago.
Neal, last one for you, and this is really just a primer for the listener who's going to talk to people who are running for office. We have so many folks who are running for the Virginia General Assembly already because of the redistricting. I want you to give the listener the best way to bring the issue of educational savings accounts this, and even beyond that, just the raw issue of money follows the child's school choice to whoever it may be, a Democrat or a Republican, so that we have some chance of getting it through the House with bipartisan. I would love to see it with bipartisan support. What should a listener to this program be saying to these candidates or asking them regarding it, so that maybe they will consider it as they get into the General Assembly?
Well, yeah, I think that the main thing everybody should say to anybody running for office, and I hope they say it to their neighbors and family and anyone else, is it fundamentally doesn't make sense to have an education system in which you are assigned to a school based on your home address. That is totally dehumanizing. Nobody looks at their own kid as just the cog that looks the same as everyone else. And we need to move to a system that fundamentally changes that, where the power lies with families to choose what is best for their kids, and the power lies with educators to set up schools. It could be, traditional schools, micro schools. It could be tutoring, but setting up educational options consistent with what they think is best, to have a real freedom for everybody, and then dynamism and this ability to tailor what is needed to individual students. And I think that what has gotten a lot of attention to this, of course, was COVID and people being very angry that their schools were closed when they wanted them open. Masking, where people said, I don't think my kid should wear a mask, and the state is making them do it, or vice versa. Many people said, I do think my kid should be wearing a mask and everybody around them should be for maximum safety, and then the state changed and said nobody can require that. They should both be saying, I should be able to seek out what I want, and other people should be able to do the same without imposing it on them. And so they should demand that. And then we've had the battles, especially in Loudoun County and Fairfax County, but other parts of the state as well, over what books do you have in the library? How do you teach gender? How do you teach race issues? And I'm afraid that too much of that debate has been about what can we force public schools to do. I feel like they're doing something I don't like. I want them to do what I like. People who are activists in that need to make the first message. It shouldn't come down to whether I can get more political power than my neighbor to force them to learn what I think everyone should learn, or they get to force me to learn what they think everyone should learn and I don't like. What we ultimately need in policy is to have money follow students. So we're going to fight these battles to see who controls public schools, but that's not what we want. The first message from everybody involved in those conflicts should be the solution ultimately is school choice, educational freedom for everyone, and we're only fighting these battles because we don't have an option.
So brilliantly said. Neal McCluskey, thank you for that. Director of the Center for Educational Freedom at the CATO Institute. Fear not, if you didn't transcribe all that, it'll be posted on our YouTube channel in our archives a little bit later on this week. Thank you so much again. It's cato.org, and have a wonderful week.
Thanks. You too.
We continue our Labor Day weekend special with Coffee Appenabeng from the Mercatus Center. Evergreening. What is it? And you'll find out next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.